Questions? You don't like Tom's questions?
What would you recommend in terms of convincing oneself that the world isn't real?
I'm trying to the world is real. The question is, what is the reality of the world? The world is real. And more specifically, does it have a reality separate from and independent from awareness? I think that's a real question. So, does the reality of the world and the reality of consciousness are the reality of the world and the reality of consciousness different? Or are they the same reality? And because I used on purpose the word, the reality of consciousness, because if we ask ourselves the question, what does it mean, the reality of consciousness? You see that ultimately, because the consciousness is an experience, the reality of an experience is the experience itself, ultimately. So the reality of consciousness is consciousness. So the reality of consciousness is consciousness. Then the reality of the world may be something else, potentially, a priori. So the question is the reality of the world and the reality of consciousness, i.e. consciousness, are they different? You see? Because I define consciousness as the real I, the real self, the reality that perceives. In order to get there, you have to convince yourself that there cannot be two realities.
I feel convinced in terms of logical arguments, and I've been trying to find a way to just see this in direct experience.
Well, when we say, I'm convinced with logical arguments, what a logical argument is something along the lines that all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. Right? But it depends on the truth of the statement we start from. Because I could say, all human beings are jerks. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is a jerk. But that doesn't work because one of my argument, the major part of the premise that all human beings are jerks is not necessarily true. And therefore, the falsity of one of the inputs triggers the falsity of the output in spite of the fact that the logic is correct. In other words, if it is true that all beings are jerks, and that Socrates is a human being, then it will be true that Socrates is a jerk. You see? So, because I'm trying to find out what do you mean when you say I am logically convinced. Because there are two ways to be logically convinced. There is the first case, about all humans are mortal, and there is the second case. You can make the statement, I am logically convinced in both cases. They are both logically convincing, you see? The problem is that one starts from facts, the second doesn't start from facts. So, when you say I'm logically convinced that there is only one reality, are you convinced by the fact that some logical in my reasoning is correct? That some logical chain of reasoning is correct? Or are you convinced by two things now? First, that the input of my reasoning logic is true, and then that the reasoning is correct. You see? Because then, if it is the latter, if you say I'm logically convinced on both counts, because the reasoning is correct, but also because the input is true, then how comes you are convinced that the input is true? Because then you cannot be logically convinced that the input is true. So the only possibility you can be convinced that the input is true is therefore experiential. So then the argument, I am convinced just logically, you see, doesn't work. You were simply diminishing the value of your understanding by calling it logical, intellectual, not enough, and therefore not convincing. Whereas in fact, it has an experiential foundation. So it's for you to know when you say that, which way, where you're coming from.
It seems that there are moments of experiential seeing that there is one reality, and moments in which, like for example, in the yoga meditation.
Wait a minute, I understand where you are going, but do you think that Newton would say, okay, there are moments when I can measure gravity and there is gravity, but there's moments, of course he's not constantly measuring that there is gravity. You know, when he's brushing his teeth, I suppose, assuming he still had teeth, he was not necessarily thinking about gravity all the time. So it's not necessary to always verify the experientially that there is only one reality. You verify it, and then you carry on. The problem is that we find ourselves often in the situation of a Newton, seeing the apple falling from the tree, saying, okay, there is gravity that he knew that, but... And then forgetting it and thinking, oh, now I am free floating. I'm levitating. And then he looks around and says, oh no, gee, no, I'm not. There is gravity. And then the moment later, he says, oh, I'm free-floating again. So then he has to look to realize that his free-floating or his whatever, levitating, was simply a figment of his imagination, but that in fact he was glued to the ground by gravity. So we find ourselves often forgetting what we have experientially verified and replacing it with the unverified belief we had accepted before. In the case in point, actually the belief we had accepted before was that there are more than one realities. That's what we are talking about. Yeah? It's not really talking about consciousness here. We are talking simply about the fact, are there more than one realities? Now, there is something that I've already said, but I think it's worth repeating. Is that although we cannot exclude a priori the possibility that there will be more than one realities, the only realities that matter to us for all practical purposes are realities that by nature are unable to interact with one another. Because then two realities that will never, have never, aren't, and will never interact, then who cares about those? Then the only one that matters is our reality. Because the other ones, they might be there, they might not be there, we'll never know, nobody will know, and they will never matter to us, right? So the only realities that matter for all practical purposes, and we are practical here, are interacting realities. So then it's hard to understand how two realities, how could there be two different realities that would be interacting? Because this interaction between the two realities kind of require the reality of the interaction itself for the interaction to be real, right? So the reality of the interaction has to also include each of the interacting reality. And therefore, the reality that enables the interaction has to be also the ultimate reality of both interacting realities. And therefore, ultimately, there is only one reality, which is this reality that enables the interaction, that makes the interaction possible. So, of course, that is not something that is absolute proof. But it is a very strong argument for an intelligent person.
And in the yoga meditations, when I become aware of a sense perception, for example, like a sound in the kitchen, and the thought arises, where you were talking about the interval between sort of a bodily sensation or a thought and a sound, like a sense perception, and there's an interpretation of that interval as space-time. Is that me as consciousness witnessing the creation of the quote-unquote world? Because the materialist hypothesis is there's a world out there. But
it's you, consciousness, witnessing Kirya's mind. curious mind is part of the totality of the manifestation, of course. But whether the world exists only in human minds, and in particular in curious mind, it's a question which is different and which we don't need to answer, and which we cannot answer based on our human phenomenal experience. And perhaps it's a question that simply doesn't have an answer, because it's a question that makes sense only from the vantage point, the limited vantage point of a human mind. Just as many questions about time make sense only from the vantage point of and the scale of a human mind. We don't know. You see, I don't know. We don't know. As I often say, the problem is not that we don't know enough, it's that we know too much, that we believe, that we know when we don't know. But food for thoughts for those who are not as homework. For instance, to understand that the reality of consciousness is consciousness itself. That's interesting. It's a little exercise.
Thank you.
Like the math teacher gives you exercises to do at home. Show that the reality of consciousness equals consciousness. And then it follows that the reality of the reality of the reality of consciousness equals consciousness, which can be easily proven mathematically.
Thank you, Francis.
Ce matin, je me suis réveillé, j'avais comme une compréhension, c'était comme si j'étais baigné dans quelque chose de très très doux.
This morning, as I woke up, it was very sweet.
Et je crois que j'ai compris quand tu dis we are cooked. Parce que.
And I think I understood what you meant when you say we are cooked.
J'ai l'impression que c'est quelque chose qui se fait en fait, qui est très naturel et qui se faisait un peu tout seul, qui était là. Et
I am under impression that that's something that happens by itself, which is very natural, that was already there.
Et que du coup ça fait du bien parce qu'il n'y a plus à attendre, des fois on peut attendre un avant et un après, alors que j'ai l'impression que c'est quelque chose qui se fait tranquillement.
So because usually we wait for before and then after, whereas in fact I am under the impression that something that happens by itself quietly.
Des fois c'est plus en arrière-plan, des fois c'est plus en avant-plan.
Sometimes it's more in the background, sometimes more in the foreground.
Et je sens que l'invitation, en fait, quand elle est là, c'est comme s'il y avait un lâcher-prise total sur... c'est comme s'il fallait lâcher prise sur ça ou s'abandonner à ça.
And I feel that when the invitation is there, it's like all we have to do is to completely let go and surrender to that.
Il n'y avait pas vraiment une question par rapport à ça, mais c'était juste
There was no question.
relater.
No. I feel like I'm translating at the UN.
C'est OK pour toi?
Yeah, yeah.
OK. Et simplement, ce parfum, cette douceur, c'est ce que je suis ou c'est juste une émanation de ce que je suis?
C'est l'expérience de ce que tu es. It is the experience of what you are. The experience of consciousness knowing itself is this perfume. So often people have the wrong impression of what the experience of consciousness, knowing itself, is like. They have a more dry, a more juiceless view, and whereas the experience of consciousness, knowing itself, is the experience of happiness, of peace, of love, of beauty. It's very simple. It's not. And also it's self-evident.
Merci.
Boring. I mean, this thing with Apple, this, what is it called? Apple Store or Apple, it's such a bore. It's such a, I mean, they are not one of my sponsors. I use this shit, but for, tell them that, what is it called, the music store? This, huh? iTunes. It's a catastrophe. It's a total. And it comes, it interrupts, it wants you to log in, you know, it wants it all the time. I mean, shut up. Okay. Vitaly Pavlyuk. It's Slavish, but which? It's not Russian. What is it? Ukrainian? Truth, love, and beauty are different facets of the same thing. This does resonate with me, and when it does, none of the three is a derivative of the two others. They are equal. This didn't meet well with what you said yesterday, that feelings are a derivative of sensations and thoughts, and are not a perception primitive of its own. In this regard, can you define love without using the word feeling? Yes. Love is the experience of our oneness with another animate being, or sometimes even with nature or with God. So, is the experience of our oneness associated. Love itself, the experience of, is the experience of this oneness, but taking the color of some bodily sensations, both before and also during and after the glimpse of our true nature. So when we go to our true nature with bodily sensations and to this oneness, and also when it is in the presence with other human beings or animals or with nature or with God. We go there through this with the body. We don't go there with the intellect. When we go there with the intellect, then it's more the experience of understanding. And when we go there through external sense perceptions, then it is more the experience of beauty. But even then, these experiences have various colors in turn. So it's like, if you will, the experience of our true nature is like white light that contains all the frequencies. And then we can divide it into three primary colors, like, what is it? Magenta, cyan, and yellow. I'm not a graphic artist, you know. Anyway, let's say magenta, some kind of blue or blue-orange, and what? Cyan, yes, cyan. Yeah. Anyway, three main colors. So truth, love, beauty. But then there are intermediary colors. And for instance, there is, if we take understanding itself, there are different varieties. For instance, there is humor is a form of understanding. When you understand a joke, right? It's a form of understanding. But love also is a form of understanding. So there are areas that are intermediary, like a purple is somewhere between a blue and between a red. But I think your question comes from the fact that what you call feelings is not what I call feeling, but so usually what we call feelings are a mix. It's a mix of bodily sensations, thoughts, sense perceptions, and the experience of our true nature. And depending on the mix between the phenomenal components, thought, bodily sensation, and sense perceptions, then it takes the color of truth, love, beauty, etc. But I was trying to say that our human experience is extremely simple. That's the point I was making. That there is nothing in our experience besides the three phenomenal components: thoughts, bodily sensations, external sense perceptions, on one hand, and the experience of consciousness, on the other hand. There is nothing else than that. But the experience of consciousness has to be understood also, because you cannot... It is the experience of happiness, peace, bliss, causeless joy. So, not something more intellectual. So a mix of that with a bodily sensation of expansion, all inclusion, would be the experience of love, for instance. Connie. When the body-mind gets tired of practicing sports, I think that's natural. But when the body-mind gets tired of other body-minds and situations, I think it is caused by a belief of being a separate entity. Is that right? What can you do about it? Welcoming it? Well, not necessarily, because we all need moments when we are on our own. And just as we need social moments. And the mix between how much we need of each varies from person to person. But more or less, all of us, you need social moment and we need private moments. And if we get too much of one of these components, there is an imbalance. It's not natural. So it depends what each individual God-given qualities requires, how much of each. If we are way out of balance, it's not healthy, it's not good. Now, what I am pointing at is that it is possible without believing to be a separate entity, without being in ignorance, to get tired if we have too much social interactions. Just as our body we won't be comfortable if we don't have enough of those. All of that is perfectly natural and it doesn't imply ignorance. However, and something I want to add is that in this social interaction, there are some social interactions that are more tiring than others. There are people, they really get you tired. It doesn't mean you are in ignorance. It means usually they are in ignorance. So there are people that can get you mightily tired, especially people who are very repetitive. So then my advice is stop listening to them. Because once you have heard twice the same thing, I mean, you have got their drift, right? You can then, fermer les écoutilles, je sais pas comment. In a ship, when the ship is sinking, you close the thing, and so that the water doesn't. So when the second time they are repeating, the third time you close the hatch, and so you have a little bit of being on your own. I mean, it's completely normal. That's the way to handle this situation, because you pay attention twice, which is very considerate. You were very considerate the second time you listen to them, so there is no need for a third time. So yes, so people can be very tiring. It has nothing to do with you. That's the point. But then, if you are yourself repetitive, and if you are yourself in ignorance, then it's self-inflicted tiredness. So that also can happen. Yes. And the other question is, so is that right? What can you do about it? Welcoming it? No, you don't want to welcome that. You want to welcome the totality of the situation. And the totality of the situation maybe, is going to tell you, get the hell out of here. Go to your bedroom, and watch a movie, or go to your bedroom and take a nap, or take a bath, and so you don't know what the moment requires. What is important is for you to be open to the totality of the situation, and then from this totality of the situation, the right attitude will come to you. And then asking also, is there also a sort of tiredness caused by awakening? I don't think so. Because what may happen is that for some time you realize how old patterns that you were indulging in, condoning, now that you see their uselessness, you can realize how tiring they were, and nevertheless, they keep running for a while out of inertia, out of habit. So then it's not that you are getting more tired, it's that you are realizing how these patterns were tiring. But awareness, not to identify with separate entity, ultimately will eliminate a lot of useless activity, a lot of useless thoughts, and also will simplify also the landscape of your body. It will eliminate a lot of useless resistances. And resistances in the body also are tiring. Luciana. She says, I'm very much looking forward to reading your next book. Okay, so the infomercial worked. We've got an advanced customer. How could I be dismissive of the questions and answers writing style of Advaita teaching? I love it. I hope so. In some instances, it is akin to poetry, or better, because it does not depend on the recognition of forms, shapes, or rhythms to be understood and felt. Yes, that's true. It is poetic in the sense of, poiein, the Greek verb. Poesia means creation. Poesy, poetry. Without creativity is no poetry. So creativity is more important than poetry. And by all means, it is the best style possible for truth lovers. How else could they listen to their teacher's words from the pages of a book? How serendipitous that you never liked writing and are now the author of books about the truth and written in the best style too. It happened more than once in the past that your answer to my question was not really to the question I asked, but the question I should have asked. Though this I would understand only after a day or two. Perhaps I am reading too much into what may be simple misunderstandings. But what do you think? Could that be possible? Yes, it is possible. I have had this experience myself with my teacher. Then she goes, hello again. Second question. For me, writing has been very important in this path. Understanding has often happened while formulating questions after listening to your satsangs. For instance, in the moment a question answers itself by turning into a non-question, or into a piece of circular reasoning, or revealing paradoxes. Could you speak about the time on this path when you listened to words and heard revelations? When paradoxes and circular logic turned from obstacle into complex and fruitful language games? When it's so far ago, I don't really remember. If some specific event comes back to me as I speak, I will mention it, but right now I'm dry. When did you start questioning the idea that meaning and understanding could only arise out of either analytical or empirically verifiable statement? don't remember, but I don't remember when, but it was certainly upon hearing my teacher's teaching. Although really the only understanding he was referring to was a glimpse of our true nature. In other words, it was noumenal understandings, noumenal, and he himself used the word apperception versus perception. Apperception, A-P-P, etc. But then I don't know whether on the regarding relative understanding, like mathematics, or I don't remember whether he would also mention that also, this type of understanding, whatever is self-evident, was also taking place in consciousness and was also some kind of a glimpse. It was a phenomenal glimpse versus a noumenal glimpse. I use the phenomenal glimpse because phenomenal understanding is an experience everybody has. And to make one understand the instantaneity, abruptness of the experience of consciousness, and also of the interval between two thoughts. So that's why I use the understanding of a joke, for instance, because before you have understood it, you cannot laugh. So that the understanding comes before the laughter, but it has to come after the punchline, otherwise you're stupid if you laugh before the punchline. So then, in this interval between the punchline and the laughter, there is this gap, discontinuity, and it drives home the understanding about understanding, experientially. Mary. Somebody writes a caption on their social media profile in German. Lobe den Herrn meine Seele. Praise the Lord. She wrote Lobe den Herrn meine Seele, but she says praise the Lord of my soul. So that would be Lobe den Herrn meiner Seele. So I don't know whether, because I don't know, Mary, which one you meant. Lobe den Herrn meiner Seele, or Lobe den Herrn, du meine Seele. So, okay. And I wonder what is the goal in this sentence. It feels a little personal. I would think the words mind, soul, with the emphasis on mind. Since non-personal or impersonal is a true experience, and you mentioned God, are you referring to the impersonal experience of God in everything and everyone? Yeah, it doesn't make any difference which interpretation. Yes, the version Lobe den Herrn meine Seele or Lobe den Herrn meiner Seele, praise the Lord of my soul, or praise the Lord, O my soul, they both have, of course, a dualistic flavor. However, it's often been the case that sages who were not at all in ignorance use a dualistic expression to celebrate their experience. We could the names of Rumi, of Kabir, and of Sri Shankara come to mind. They all have written poems that feel dualistic, whereas in fact they were sages. So that's something you can understand. It's a poetic expression. It's kind of going back to duality to celebrate non-duality. I have run out of non-Tom questions here. Do you have any questions?
I have a question about choice, about choosing. And to make it clear, I will use an analogy that you sometimes refer to. So let's say you are 14, 15 years, it's 1960, you live in France, and a few of your companions say, wow, look, I've got a package of cigarettes, let's come together and hide and smoke it. And since you want to be part of the group, you start smoking, and then you get hooked because the state and industry do everything they can to make it feel good, to look like the Marlboro cowboys. You want to be one of those. So can you really say that you could choose to start smoking in an environment where all adult men, or many of them, just smoke?
As a separate person, we don't choose. It's all conditioned.
Mm-hmm.
When I say that we are free, we are not free as a separate person. We are free as consciousness. Then the moment as consciousness we have chosen to be a separate individual, then we retain a mock freedom, a shadow
Right.
of freedom, but not a real freedom. And we remain in this condition of bondage, meaning total absence of freedom, up until we question our being a separate entity. At that moment, a moment when this question arises in us, we recover our freedom. As long as we are in doubt about being a separate entity, we are free.
So if I get that right, consciousness, like in my case, but I think I could speak in case of most people here, we grew up in an environment that was where almost everyone was deep in ignorance. So can you say that consciousness chose ignorance for our environment, but we, as an ignorant person, we had no choice at all?
Yeah, but because the consciousness chose that that cigarettes were available, that
right.
that adults around us smoked, that we were at the age of puberty, and
right.
we wanted to
be part of
be like an adult, and
right.
to claim our freedom, to be an adult and to do as adults. But all of that is kind of
conditioning
and ignorance. And so all of that, the fact that some of us would start smoking, others wouldn't, was kind of automatic in both cases. There was no freedom there.
So can you say that freedom only starts coming into question the moment we start doubting?
Yes.
To be a separate individual?
Yes. To doubt means not to know, really.
Yeah, okay.
So, in this not knowing, we are free.
Right.
Because in this not knowing, we are that which we are. Freely. In ignorance, we believe to be a separate entity, and as consciousness, we give, if you will, the universe the order to manifest accordingly, at least for this body-mind, with which we momentarily choose to identify. Then the events in the world will appear in accordance with that. So it will seem to us that we have a limited freedom, that we have some limited freedom. But in fact, it's not true, because if you think about it, any decision we make comes as a thought. Any deliberate decision comes as a thought, and we don't choose our thoughts. So this, as a separate entity, we don't choose our thoughts.
Right.
Because if it was the case, we could choose to have only pleasant thoughts, or loving thoughts, or intelligent thoughts, whatever. But we don't choose our thoughts. They come to us. They are cosmic events. Even if we take a materialistic model in which the machine that creates the thoughts is the brain, right? So the brain is a local convergence of universal forces, right? The four forces. That there are only four that we know of, right? That locally converge and creates all this movement in the brain that translates into thoughts. So even in a materialistic model, there is no individual freedom. There is no freedom of thought. So that's why, that's why in a sense, the materialist model is in a sense closer to non-duality than the religious model.
Yeah.
Because the religious model brings into the equation an individual soul. You see, an individual consciousness that is simply not there in the materialist model. So the problem is that materialists are never really materialist. That they unknowingly are inconsistent with themselves. Because, for instance, often materialists judge other people, right? But then, if you're a true materialist, the decisions made by other people are made by these material brains, right? And these material brains are totally conditioned with the universe that surrounds them, so there is nobody there to be bad or good. So if they start judging people, it means they are poor materialists because they are inconsistent. But true absolute materialism is very close to non-duality.
Thank you.
It's what you just said, that there's no individual soul, right? So my question is, like, when we look at different teachers of non-duality, whatever, each one experience their awakening in a very unique way. So where is that the uniqueness coming from? Yeah?
Oh, there are individual body minds. But what I mean by individual soul mean individual consciousness. Of course, obviously there are individual body minds. This body mind is very short to play tennis, for instance. So you cannot pretend to be. You see, so we are different.
But even like levels of awakenings are, you can feel, right, different in different people. Like some people go all the way to realization, some stuck in like very lower level.
I mean, awakening wisdom is completely free. It blows wherever it wants. The teachings are more important than the human guru. And the understanding of the teachings is more important than the teachings, obviously. The perfection is only in that which understands the teachings. That is perfect. So the origin of the teaching, the source of the teachings, and the destination of the teaching is the same. That's like sometimes in geometry, a straight line can be understood as a circle which has an infinite radius. And so, straight line. And then the two endpoints kind of connect together in some imaginary place. So that's where the beginning and the end connect each other, the alpha and the omega. The origin of the teachings, the giver of the teaching and the receiver of the teachings are this endpoint, and the circle gets perfect.
On the way over there.
Yeah, it's called a mic jack.
Yeah. Right place, right time, I guess.
Mic jacking. As long as it is not an armed mic jack, it's okay.
A non-violent mic jack.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that was too You used the term earlier, curious mind, and I've heard you say mind quite a bit, and I don't have a good feel for what you're saying when you say mind.
Oh yes, I don't. I'm not always that precise, you know. So, interest, curiosity. In fact, the interest and the curiosity, you're correct. I stand corrected. They don't come from the mind. They come from love. They come from our true nature. They expressed this curiosity, interest, love. They expresses itself sometimes as a question, and the question is formulated, and then the formulated question is mind stuff, yes. But the source of the question was the interest, the love for the truth, and that's not mind stuff. The love for the truth, then it's like the string of a guitar, and the love is the musician that plucks the strings. Then the resonance of the string is the mind. The resonance, the vibration of the string is the thought in the mind. But if it were not for the musician, the string wouldn't resonate. So it is the interest and the divine origin of the interest for the truth that makes the mind ask question and resonate.
Francis. I must admit that went over my head. You commented science, the source of science being the truth, you know, the curiosity or the, you know, investigation. But in phenomenalities, flux, change, but it just seems awfully miraculous that we have these mathematical equations, laws of physics, the hard sciences that really really reinforce separation. It seems to.
How?
Being able to, with the mind, to define something, you know, this and that, and the consistency, seemingly, you know, the observed consistency in the laws of nature or physics.
But this consistency is extraordinary because it points at a oneness beyond space and time, because the laws of physics apply uniformly across space-time. They are not different on the moon or in distant galaxies that they are on the surface of the Earth. And they are not different now that they were when Newton was born. So this consistency of the laws of physics across space-time points at a reality which spans across space-time. So that's very important. In other words, this reality, it unites all the phenomena in an extraordinary way when we think of it. For the discovery of the laws themselves, yes, we scientists use the analytical method with extreme simplification in the hard sciences, and it is this extreme simplification of the condition of the experiment that enables us to reach this high level of certainty and of precision, whereas there are many other domains, such as the economics or climate science, where you cannot predict what the value of the Dow Jones is going to be in 3 years or in 50 years. You see what I mean? Although there are equations, mathematical equations in economy, but it's too complicated. Whereas in science, in the hard science, we can really simplify most of the data, most of the parameters of an experiment, so that then we can only play with a few parameters, change them to find out the laws, to discover the laws. So anyway, so the analytical method is used, yes, just to discover the laws and analytical models, but what the outcome of it is extraordinary, because it points at this one reality that we call nature in science, but which is so much in line with non-duality that the non-duality is the best thinkable epistemology for a scientist. It's much more satisfying than a God, or than materialism, or than all the atomistic realism and all the models, philosophical models that are dualistic. Yes, so I sometimes people think that I'm bashing science because I am pointing at its limitations, but most scientists, at least scientists who are not taking science as a religion, but who understand that science has a limited scope, would agree with me.
And it also seems in science, as well as archaeology, that throughout the world, things kind of happen almost at the same time, or close.
I don't know about archaeology, for me, like history, I mean, to call history science is such an abuse of language. I mean, what is... What are the experiments in history? No, the word science is deeply abused. The scientific method requires humility for the facts, only the facts. A theory has to be verifiable and falsifiable experimentally. In other words, for instance, an economic simulation is not science. And the consensus among peers has to be a real consensus. It has to be absolute among peers, such as a consensus that exists about Newtonian mechanics or quantum mechanics. There is a consensus. You won't find one single physicist that says quantum mechanics is false. Not one single in the world. That's the beauty of hard science, if you will. And something else which is extraordinary, which is this uncanny relation there is between mathematics and hard science and physics. In other words, between mathematical ideas and systems that seem to be created by man, by human mind, and on the one hand, and the outcome of experiments on matter conducted by physicists, and the correspondence there is between these two is just extraordinary. And often mathematicians would come up with some mathematical theory or mathematical, and then it would apply so beautifully to describe very deep physical phenomena. For instance, Hilbert space. Hilbert was a mathematician that came up with this a little weird concept of some kind of vector space that has certain properties and operators working on that space. And then the quantum phenomena were discovered in the beginning of the 20th century. Several models were created, and, one by Dirac, another one by De Broglie in France, and then all of a sudden this genius mathematician von Neumann said, but we have the perfect mathematical tool. That's the Hilbert space. That was created a long time, not a long time, but sometime before by a mathematician out of the blue, and boom, the two collide. There is something, there is a form of serendipity, we would say, between these two fields, which is beautiful for those who. It's very beautiful. It makes you believe that there is God. Or, to be more precise, for me, it tells us that there is a deep connection between consciousness, the human consciousness, seen as human, which creates these mathematical ideas, and nature, which creates these phenomena in the world. So, this connection already is something. Now, you can say, what is the simple connection between two things? It's the identity. In other words, the connection between human consciousness and nature, reality of the phenomena, the simple connection, the simples between the two would be to say they are the same. That's non-duality. So now you can wake up.
Hi, Francis. It's self-evidential knowledge that consciousness is. You previously alluded to phenomenal glimpses, which have the attribute of self-evidence to them. It's self-evident that you got the joke, or that you understand. Would you say it's right to say that every time there is an experience of self-evident experience, it is a reference to consciousness itself?
Yes. The source of self-evidence is consciousness. Because consciousness, in fact, it's the basic, the fundamental self-evidence.
just in continuation. Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
What?
Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Gödel?
His incompleteness theorem, the mathematical theorem.
Yes, yes.
Which shows that...
which one? The first one or the second one?
Second one, I think. Which shows that some things cannot be proven. They're self-evidential.
No, it shows, the second one shows that if you have an axiomatic mathematical theory, that such a theory cannot be self-consistent. In other words, that there will be some proposition in this theory that can be proved true and proven false.
And would you say those propositions derive their self-evidence straight from consciousness?
I mean, there are a lot, I don't remember exactly the proof of Gödel's theorem, but there are a lot of assumptions that are made in this proof. It doesn't come out of the blue. For instance, there is a use of the property of the natural numbers in the proof, right? Because all the so it is a little bit disheartening for mathematicians that mathematics, axiomatic mathematical system cannot be perfect. That there is always this possibility of weird proposition. But then what mathematicians can do is that when they discover such a discrepancy, because we are talking about we are getting bored here, everybody, but because we are talking about axiomatic systems. So what happens is that when you discover a proposition which is heretical, if you will, which is politically incorrect in the system, then what you can do is add some axiom to the axiomatic system, and then it will become kosher, because only with adding this axiom, only one of the proposition will be true. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So in this way, there is still hope for the mathematicians that they can always, by adding some, completing their axiom, the system, it will never be perfect, but they can always make it perfect
by adding this proposition. Thank you.
But it has nothing to do really with what we are talking about here.
Hi, Francis. I'm again having some conflict to ask this question or not. Because my question is about vegetarianism, and I think it's nothing to do with the finding happiness, but you sometimes say about that, and you were a little harsh sometimes.
I say what?
Huh?
What?
You were a bit harsh because I'm not vegetarian, and you hardly, sometimes rarely, but you say about vegetarianism, and yeah, and you are a little harsh about meat eater. Harsh. You said the meat eaters are killer. You said something like that.
Yes, kind of.
Yeah. I mean because I'm little trust Francis. So if you personally say to me, oh, that's nothing to forget about it. I will not care, but yeah, but
But you know, I'm a killer of mosquitoes also. I am a killer of mosquitoes.
oh. Yeah. 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 Okay, so yeah, happy.
But as Alex pointed the other day, it's self-defense. So he pointed out that it is self-defense. So
Yeah, okay. So
but what's the problem?
problem, not really problem, because I'm not vegetarian and I don't want to eat meat, but in my culture and the environment, it is just practical, just it's available and price and things are just community and things just easy to do. So, but sometimes when I listen your satsang and meat eaters are killer and gee, I'm affected. So that was question and you mentioned about compassion, and one reason was a compassion of empathy is similar.
I say love for animals. When people ask me why are you vegetarian, I say two things. First, I love animals.
Yeah.
And number two, I've been vegetarian for 40 years, and I'm still alive. So if it kills me, it is killing me slowly. So that's usually what I say. Because the people think that I say that for religious reasons, because no. And my teacher was vegetarian. And actually I had begun being a vegetarian before I met him. But so I was eating one vegetarian meal a week. I went into this habit because I was doing yoga, but I thought that vegetarianism equals being macrobiotics, which was very limiting. And then I was invited at my teacher's place, a little bit like here, you see, where you have this beautiful food, and the food was so delicious that I didn't feel at all limited by the vegetarianism. And then so when I came back home, I became a full-time vegetarian, and that was it.
Okay, and the sympathy, it's kind of it was related when you were answering about vegetarianism. One reason you mentioned was sympathy, the shared, the feeling what others feel, like sympathy, compassion.
For animals, yes.
Yeah.
I said I love animals, love, compassion.
Okay, compassion.
What's the difference?
Yeah, I want to ask about the compassion. I feel what others feel more easily some than others, and
you don't feel what animals feel.
Less than, because animals are for instance, animals don't have less facial expression, or the fish and the bugs. It's more difficult to feel, isn't it? To what they feel.
I must say that I communicate more easily with dogs than with many human beings. Because they are very simple, they don't hide their feelings. They are very straightforward. What you see is what you get.
Yes, that was I was curious that how do I know the one very scammer coming to me, oh my grandma, I needed some, I'm hungry and can I give me, and she's suffering, I should help her, but maybe she was not suffering. So it's not really, how do I know? It's imagination or my interpretation?
There is always a margin for error, but when a dog is hungry, you know it.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Francis. I had a question I haven't really thought about, something you mentioned earlier about materialism all the way. And so I was thinking about it, and something in academia where I've been for quite some time, in materialism, they have this idea of emergence.
Yeah.
And I haven't studied it too much, but it sounds like almost like magic. There are certain basic principles or certain laws or certain scenarios that happen which they can explain. And then when they are present, then some other higher kind of phenomena happens. And now they have this idea of radical emergence, which is just too radical form of emergence, and they kind of classify it more in philosophy. A quick example of that would be the use of computers initially in World War II to break the German ciphers. And later on, through several series of events, it results in the advent of personal computers and smartphones and stuff. And it just sounds too magical, and that is sometimes classified as radical emergence. So I guess what I'm hinting at is that in a pure materialism, there's cause and effect, because there are these particles or subunits. And it seems like even in the phenomenal world, at some level, cause and effect seems to break down. And if you add subjectivity to it, I'm trying to imagine how is materialism possible, because then you have consciousness or subjective experience as an emergent phenomena that is not material. So then now you have two things, two different, one is non-material and one is material. So I guess I was just wondering, how does a consistent materialistic theory or system counter that?
Yeah, what you in a materialist system, what is called matter, in fact, is the reality of nature. Because depending on the progress of science, we have models of matter. For instance, with the birth of chemistry in the 17th and 18th century, matter was thought to be made out of the elements of the Mendeleev table, right? The periodic element. And then it was discovered that the atom was made, in fact, of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then other elementary particles were discovered. And so at one point, it was made of, we don't know what, then it was made of molecules, atoms, some elementary particles, and quark and gluons, and then, etc. So it is always a work in progress. So the answers that are given are always provisional by science. So for a materialist admits, either he's stupid or he admits that these answers are provisional, and that therefore what he refers to as matter when he says everything is made of matter is the reality of these physical phenomena. Right? That's what he calls matter. He calls matter not the physical phenomena in and by themselves, but he calls matter really the reality of the physical phenomena. So matter equals nature in that sense without God. for the materialist, right? So there is only nature. So then when you have the subjective sphere, what is important is that the reality of the phenomena is kind of distinct from the phenomena somehow. Because it's everywhere, for instance, and the phenomena are localized. The laws of physics are valid throughout time. So whereas a phenomenon is localized, an event in space and time. So there is this notion of a reality. Matter becomes a reality. So by becoming a reality, it kind of loses its provisional aspect as molecules, atoms, particles, granite-like building block of the universe. That goes down the drain. What was called atomistic realism was precisely that reality is made of an assembly of atoms like a Lego piece. That has been totally destroyed by quantum mechanics. Atomistic realism is not an option any longer. So meaning the reality is not made of atoms. So the reality is something else, it's global, it's anyway. So reality. On the other hand, to say that the subjective area is emerging from reality is not a problem, because reality has already distanced itself from the phenomena in the world. So because it has distanced itself, it has lost its matter-like quality, if you will. And then because it has lost its matter-like quality, it becomes possible for it to be also the substance out of which the subjective experience is made, the consciousness experience. You see? Otherwise, what you were referring to is an old philosophical paradox, which is called the dualism paradox since Descartes, when we divide the experience in subjective experience in the sense of subtle experience and physical or gross experience. Where do these two realms, the realms of thoughts and the realms of physical objects, where do they connect? Where does a thought interact with matter? You see? Because there is such an interaction. If I think I'm going to lift my hand, and then I lift my hand, there was a thought, and then there is a physical manifestation. And conversely, if I drink too much sangria, then it may have some impact on the quality of my thoughts. So there is a two-way street between the physical world and the subtle world. So where does this connection happen? So that's if you see the physical world as just physical and the mind world as just mind, it never happens. So there must be somewhere a common ground, and the only possibility is consciousness and reality. So that's where the common ground can be found. And that's the only interesting explanation I have regarding the dualism paradox. At least it satisfies this mind.
Yes, it is satisfying, and when you were describing that, it seems like something you always refer to is the interaction, that the moment you have an interaction, it somehow there's an intuition that there is a unity there.
Yes.
So, thank you.
There is a connection. If there is a connection, meaning there is not a discontinuity. And if there is not a discontinuity, if there is a connection, it means two connected things become the same thing. You know, you glue two things together and then the glue disappears. And then they have become one single thing.
Thank you.
I caught the